thank you everyone for joining us for this book promotion of one wonderful book by Joanne Iverson. Jo is speaking to us from Brighton, and she's a little bit under the weather, so if you hear a few coughs and splutters, then she's been very brave to actually do this for us. So really big thank you for her.
Right there.
So over to you, Jo, and I'll be in the background. Please do use the chat room if you want to ask questions or make any comments as we go through. So thank you, Jo. Over to you. Thank you.
John, do I do the slides myself?
Yes, you can just put the little arrows on the bottom left.
Yeah, got it. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm so flattered there's so many of you. Excuse me, wheezing and coughing. This is my first day out of bed with flu, so whatever. I am describing my book because I've been invited to, which is a privilege. However, I am going to start off describing what had me write it, and I hope the purpose is much bigger than me promoting my book. Diana, thank you. It's very sweet of you. I was lucky enough to be trained many, many years ago in yoga, and frustrated to hell because I couldn't understand how to apply the anatomy I was studying to the movements I was seeing. It's the simplest way of putting it. It just made no sense to me at all. And of course, like many of us, I'm sure, well, certainly people I've met and students I've worked with, participants in all the courses I've done, I wasn't the only person who thought I was the idiot because I didn't understand the anatomy well enough. And I learnt my origins and my insertions and my biomechanical principles. And they didn't explain the movements and the differences in the people in the yoga class. And in 1998, Tom Myers was in the UK, and Peter Blackerby, who is an osteopath and was my first teacher, invited him through the osteopathic school to come and talk to us in the yoga school. Hi, all the people joining us. Hi, Juliet. And Tom Myers walked in. I'll never forget. 1998. This was, which it's a long time ago, but he walked into this beautiful centre that we had in Brighton, and he said, "There ain't no muscle connected to no bone, nowhere in no body." And you've got to think of this in context. Here's this American dude, and Tom is a dude, and he's got his sunglasses on his head, and he's leaning back on the wall, and he's all cool, and it's just like he committed anatomical heresy in the classroom in front of us. And I was intrigued because I'm a complete maverick, obviously, and basically I signed up to do his training in structural integration, Rolfing by any other name. And I travelled 2000 to 2000 no 99 to 2001. I did a 2-year training, and I really I loved anatomy trains. I loved how the principle, I got how this principle of continuity, that muscles and connective continuities could somehow relate to movement. And anatomy trains hadn't come out at that time. I read the proofs when they arrived with Tom. I was there in America. And at the time, I was a resident author at Cassell's among my other jobs. I was a chocolatier, but I'll tell you about that later, and it's relevant, believe it or not. Anyway, so I was an author at the time, and I said to Tom, I'd love to proofread your book for you, and it turned out that it was published by English publishers, Elsevier, and Mary Law and Serena Wolfard were his publishers. And I got to read the proofs and cut my anatomical teeth, if you will, on anatomy trains. And I worked with Tom and eventually became one of his teachers, and then said, please, can I take anatomy trains to the UK and teach it to movement teachers? Because I think it's a brilliant lens, and I think not everybody wants to be a structural integrator. And I want to make movement make sense. And Tom said, be my guest, great. And we had big plans to do all sorts of things. And life being life, it didn't quite work out how it was supposed to, but I ended up going down a slightly different route and creating my own yoga teacher training, because what I came across was a huge lack of understanding amongst yoga teachers who had done something standard, if you like eye-tech anatomy. And like me, they were very kinesthetic. I started off doing fine art and English many moons ago. And as an artisan chocolatier most of my life at that time, we're talking 20 years ago, I was very kinesthetic, and I worked with chocolate all day long. So I was dabbling in soft matter. I didn't know the importance of that at the time, but I wasn't happy with the idea that this is a lever, and this is a lever, and this is a system of levers, because the other thing was, at the time, I was married to and the daughter of very skilled mechanical engineers. And when you live and grow up with mechanical engineers, they can drive you mad, but they are brilliant, brilliant minds, and they want to know why things work the way they do and how they work. So I suppose I inherited and married my desire to understand how things work and why they work that way. And so I didn't carry on working with Tom, but I created a yoga teacher training school. I founded it in 2006, and it ran from 2008 to 10 in the art of contemporary yoga and the science of body architecture. And we taught the anatomy trains principles, and we taught the principles of working with the fascia. And I got to work with Robert Schleip a lot. I ended up presenting all his, facilitating all his UK workshops, and we became good friends and colleagues. And I ended up studying his work till it was coming out of my ears, and I wanted to know more. And I ended up working a little bit with Jaap van der Waal and studying all his papers. And Robert helped me learn to read papers, and then did webinars, and ended up being invited by Dr. Stephen Levin to work with him and his team. And then I met Leonid Blyum and John Sharkey and all these fabulous people who are involved in biotensegrity. And cut a long story short, Serena Wolfard and Robert Schleip conspired to have a book written about yoga and fascia, which is this. So I was invited in to do it, and I found myself needing to bridge 3 domains. And I'm going to say this up front, because I think unless you understand this, it's not going to make sense to you. The book's not going to make sense, but neither is fascia, quite frankly. So the 3 parts were not fascia, anatomy, and movement, funnily enough. The 3 aspects were the 3 aspects of us that fascia comes and makes sense of. So first we have the animating or activating the intellectual mind. So intellectually, part 1 of the book reflects the research, the story, the history, and the how and the why and the what of fascia. And I did my utmost to go through as many of the most relevant papers as I could, and absolutely not be on a kind of a my way is the way bandwagon, but to go out there and give a neutral explanation of the way the fascia works and what it is and what the research has led to and why it makes sense of our biology. Part 2 was animating the body architecture. In other words, how do we, because as a yoga teacher and a structural integrator, I'm very interested in how do we apply that? How do we take that intellectual stuff, and rather than extrapolating it and turning it through some marketing guru that then allows us to sell it as the next best thing in flexibility or fascia training, I mean, there is some serious nonsense being peddled out there. And yes, I take no prisoners. I won't name anybody, but my God, be careful what you read on the internet and see on YouTube, because there is some utter nonsense. Now, that doesn't mean that I haven't written any nonsense, but I went to the people that wrote what I've written and asked them to assist me in making sure that I presented their work. So it's my take, but I've done my utmost throughout the book to explain it in a way that honors the people that preceded me. Anyone you come across who is claiming to have invented fascia or invented fascia training, or because of the way they deal with the fascia, your fascia can work, just turn a blind ear and walk away, because this has been going on with this understanding been going on for years, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So I just want to open this whole thing up. Yes, Diana, the Julian does it in does a lot of work with the fascia. I'll talk about that later. So anyway, onto the subject we're on, animating the body's architecture. Finally, because the book is yoga, I talked about illuminating the emotional body, and what that gave me access to was able to talk about the spirit, able to illuminate the emotional being, and make a little bit of sense of how fascia is involved right across the field of what's now called interoception. So it's not just our understanding of the research, it's how we feel through the body. And then on to the next, I call it the next dimension, where we actually talk about the energy system and the sacred geometry, or the geometry of our biology, that resonates and gives us fields of resonance. And that goes into the realm of energy medicine. And we have to be very careful to know which realm we're in, not because the fascia doesn't span them all necessarily, but because I think we have a duty of care to follow through the research that we have access to and make sure that we're very grounded in what we say about fascia, because it's a bit of a fascia free-for-all out there at the moment. And you can end up hurting people with the best intentions and not meaning to, because you just don't get that this is a paradigm shift. It's not just a new content. It's not like, oh, we had muscles and bones before and now we've added the fascia and this is what the fascia does. It's not like that. Fascia literally changes the context in which we understand muscles and bones. And what I want to do now is go through the book quite quickly. Well, I don't do anything quickly, but we'll go through anyway. And we'll start with part one, which is all about the research. This is somebody who graduated from the Art of Contemporary Yoga, someone called Katie Courts Giller now. And I just love these images. We went to great lengths to design them. I've subsequently seen other people have done this before us, but we honestly didn't know. We sat with a drawing board, the photographer and I, David, David, can't remember his surname. It's gone out of my head. Oh, crazy. It's in the book. It's in the book. It's in the book. David, you're in the front page. David Woolley, of course. David Woolley, photography, utterly brilliant. So sorry, David. And we spent absolutely the greatest time having these tubes made and putting the girls in them and having the lighting such that you could see, because it's a visual metaphor for the fascia. My life started in art, and you can imagine creative expression and ballet and dance and so on. And so this was heaven to me, was to be able to come up with a metaphor and somehow describe how the fascia works as a tensional network, but as a tensional architecture in 3 dimensions at least. And it's in 3D in the body. It's animated, it's lengthened, it's tensioned, it has different depths, and it's something we can't imagine. And being able to see it through Jean-Claude Gamberto's work is really a privilege, because a lot of my training was done before any of that ever came about. So this is Katie inside her sleeve, and the picture is very copyright, so please be aware of that. And it's the picture in the opening chapter of the book, and I love them. So in part one, I look at the art of contemporary yoga, which is obviously more yoga based. I look at ancient wisdom and new knowledge, where we look at the history of the fascia and how it informs what we're doing. Thank you, Susie. Then I go on to the science of body architecture, which is a bit the history of how fascia came to being understood as we understand it now. Then I talk about biotensegrity, because what biotensegrity does is it explains the 3-dimensional part. So to just go back a second, this is a biotensegrity organization, what you're looking at now. In this image at this moment, the tensional member is the fabric and the compressional member is the body. But the body, as Katie lengthens into it, they're mutual tension compression arrangements that can change. So that's what happens inside. We can't just say, oh, the bones are the compression members and the skin is the tension. It's not like that. It's a tension compression architecture, which I'll explain a bit later. And it moves, and it's a movable three-dimensional feast of emergent properties. And this is the hardest thing to get about biotensegrity, is that it changes all the time, because that's what we do. So that's why I got so excited about biotensegrity, because it started to make sense of exactly the aspect of anatomy that I couldn't understand, is that no two people seem to have the same anatomy. The book says it's like this. The people say it's like this and 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 this. And how do you correlate those things? And I just couldn't do it until I started putting anatomy trains together, until I started to understand biotensegrity. So if you want, you can think about these as stepping stones that we started off in sort of one-dimensional anatomical parts, and we need to know what they are. So learn your anatomy, for goodness sake. Then we went to two-dimensional, which is kind of anatomy trains, where they all got joined up in lines. And now we're moving to three-dimensional, which is biotensegrity and how those lines create spaces and hold spaces and form spatially. And so you can think of it like that. You can think classical anatomy, something like anatomy trains or kinematic chains, and then thirdly, biotensegrity. And you put those three things together and you've got the 1, 2, 3 dimensions of understanding. That's quite a good way of thinking about it, just to hold it in and get to the paradigm shift. Anyway, so then I talk about the remarkable human blueprint. I will go quickly through these chapters, which is our embryology, the breath, the bones, and the dermatomes, which is me starting to get argumentative about the fact that I don't think physiology is separate from anatomy and separate from biomechanics. Spines, lines, and automobility offers a slightly different take on the spine. Not that I've got a different take, but I just offer researchers' different take. Well, I do, because I couldn't find evidence for what I was reading in life. The elastic body explains elasticity and gets us closer to biotensegrity. Sense and sentience is all based on Robert Schleip's work and why the fascia is the largest sensory organ of the body. And the fascial forms, which is a very, well, as technical as I get, chapter all about what fascia is and isn't, and talks about Dean Juhan's work and other people that precede the glut of wannabe fascia experts that keep coming up on Facebook and sending me nuts, bluntly. Jan. John, are you able to supply that image now at this moment that goes with this particular piece? Yes, exactly. Hi, Julie. Oh, wow. Right, there you go. Thank you, John. This was sent to me by Robert Schleip because he's so generous with his research and he's such a fabulous mentor. This is one of the most recent and kind of formal diagrams of what fascia is and fascia isn't. What is intramuscular fascia, in other words, that which is between the muscles. What is superficial fascia, that which is on the back of the skin immediately under your hand. The visceral fascia and the different densities. You can see the chart has on the left-hand side from dense to loose. So the closer we get to the surface, the superficial fascia, the less dense it becomes. And the closer we get to the deeper layers of the body walls and the internal body, the denser it gets. And this is quite a clever schematic, really. It shows how what they call proper fascia is very, very dense, very close to the bone. Not necessarily, but it can be. Aponeurosis, which is a tendinous sheets. So it's like a tendon is more tubular-like in appearance, and aponeurosis is more sheet-like in appearance. A ligament, which obviously is what is between bone on bone. So there are many people arguing that the periosteum, the fascia around the bone, is continuous with the joint capsule and the ligamentous tissue between the bones, and the tendon, which is obviously that muscle becomes continuous with the periosteum. And in the dissection program, you get to see so clearly that these are not separate entities. But you couldn't even say that 10 years ago, unless you knew Jaap van der Waal, but we'll get to that. So stay with me and don't worry. So we get less and less dense as we're more superficial, more and more dense as we're more deep. And I'll answer your question in a minute. Hi, Fiona. And we get more and more regular in this graph of the tissue, and more irregular as it gets more dense. The meningeal fascia would partly be considered in the visceral scheme of things, in the organic fascia, and it would be considered at a very deep depth, but it's specialized. And the specializations are not fully accounted for here, John. So you have to kind of allow that this is a schematic of a body that is not, this isn't the body. This isn't what the body looks like, even vaguely. And this is one of the big problems that everybody's having. You've got people like Jean-Claude Gamberteau, who says there are no layers. There are no layers. And he'll stand and even shout at Carla Stecco and Antonio Stecco for their beautiful work showing the different layers of the fascia, that these layers are not how the body behaves in life. And so this schematic is a general overview to give people a sense that the fascia is not just a discrete area of the lumbosacral architecture where there's less muscle and more fascia. It actually pervades the whole body. It's what holds us together. Muscle resides within it. However, it's invested throughout muscle. So muscle fiber, muscle fibril, actin, myosin, it's all, if you like, ensheathed or invested with or ubiquitously contextualized by, i.e. everywhere, this fascia in its different expressions and different characteristics, yet it's all joined. You know, the meningeal fascia doesn't, it's not separate from that which is around it, and the dura of the spine, and the, actually speaking of that and what Jan's just written, we opened the whole spinal dura in the teal dissection, and all the membranous hydrated, or apparently hydrated from the dissection method, all the membranous parts of it were still intact, still visible, still holding fluid, and we were able to see the fluid motion of the cerebrospinal fluid. Unfortunately, the cerebrum and the tentorium and the brain tissue is not preserved by this method. That's the downside of it. That it just turned to mush. So unfortunately, we couldn't see that. But I can't tell you how. Just remember, this is a schematic. This is not fascia. You know, it's like going to the doctor and the doctor treats the X-ray and doesn't actually look at you. There's nothing more frustrating. You know, you are not an X-ray. The X-ray informs you about the living body, and this informs you as a schematic guide that superficial fascia is different and looser and than tendon, but it's just a schematic. You know, don't do your head in. But thank you, Robert. It's beautiful. Can you, John? Thank you. There we go. Brilliant. Now, excuse me. Geometry. The fascia is basically, when you view Jean-Claude Gamberteau's work, when you view it in a teal dissection where it's not dehydrated and stratified, i.e. layered, because it's not layered in the human body, you could say there is layering, but you'd be pushing its depths. It has different depths and it has different characteristics and expressions at those different depths. So when you see a YouTube clip showing you what you do to the fascia when you use this method, be very, very skeptical, because it may only be the superficial most fascial aspect that is behaving like that. The deeper periosteal fascia may not even be affected, and it would be different for each person depending on that treatment. So this will drive you mad to get, but you have to get it. The fascia is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It is not the same everywhere. It has different expressions depending on where it is and how you use it and who it belongs to. What makes us all the same is that we are all unique, and that makes us all the same. Welcome to the world of paradox. And if you can't enter the world of paradox and the world of polarity as distinct from duality, you've had it. Put the book down, leave the webinar now, go home and give up whatever it is you're doing, because you will not get there if you want to be dualistic and say the fascia is this, it's not this, therefore. It doesn't work like that. It is usually a spectrum where the polarity expressed in that previous image is, it can be very dense or not very dense. It can be very regular or not very regular. It can be very stuck and stiff, or not very stiff and not very stuck at all. It can glide. It can be much too floppy, in which case it's too flexible, which is often more dangerous than being too stiff, because we need a new vocabulary. So you see where I'm coming from. It's a whole other world, and it bursts us out of the two-dimensional anatomical lines even. They're an upgrade on one-dimensional anatomical parts, but they do not get us to volumetric fascial matrices in a network that lives in the round. So you can get the paradigm shift. This is what gets us to the round. Leonardo da Vinci's drawings of these are four-dimensional. What makes them four-dimensional? I'm going to do this really simply, and I'm sure some of you will argue with me, but please don't, because I haven't got time to go into any one aspect tonight, is that, it's past 7 and I've only got to the second page, is that this geometry is, time is not the fourth dimension. Time is the medium. Time and space are the media in which the fourth dimension occurs and includes. The fourth dimensional object is something that moves through itself. And Leonardo was unbelievable. You can see through these objects, they can move through themselves. If you look up 4-dimension on the internet, you will see these shapes moving through themselves in animation. And it's very difficult because we live in a 3D world, so it's almost impossible for us to see 4D. And this part of the book, just before I get to this, links you into sacred geometry, which I deal with in part 3. So you understand we are in a world of body geometry. And Leonardo da Vinci understood that, and makes a lot of sense of his work later on. He was an architect and he understood a great deal that we can learn. So this is a picture from the book of how we use exercises, practical exercises throughout the book to show people how to feel the different qualities of the fascia. You can put your thumb on your palm and your fingers on the back of your hand and just wiggle your fingers. And you can immediately feel the different qualities of glide on the back and the front of the hand. And immediately you understand what I've already said, which is that the fascia has different characteristics depending on how it's used. So if I go to pick up my glass, as I've been doing all my life, it's the inside of my hand that gets the use, not the back of my hand. We don't pick up glasses with the back of the hand. So the back of the hand has a different quality, different function, less adhesion. The front of the hand has different behavior because it requires to be used differently. So it's more tethered and more dense. Same fascia, different expression. The picture in the middle at the top is the rectus abdominis, the aponeurotic sheath underneath it. And the one at the bottom is one of Jean-Claude Gamberto's images, which if you haven't seen them, get your hands on them. They are amazing. And because he's got an endoscopic camera going under the skin of a living body into a semi-closed space, because of course he's had to enter the camera, he's showing something much more like what's going on inside us before we're cut open. And these are called fibrillar networks or microvacuolar, meaning the spaces are contained, and tubular. And people expect to see these sort of furry filaments, like because of Gil Hedley's fuzz. And in fact, that was dry tissue. It wasn't a very accurate presentation. And Gil will tell you that now himself. The tubes are, the tubularness is this collagenous, proteinous, fluids, hydrated ability to express itself in different ways. So it's like jelly a bit. And this is another image of one of the graduates in another tube, showing again another aspect of how, depending on where she is in space, the fabric of the tube is tensioned in a different way. And that's precisely how your tissue works. However, it's a metaphorical expression of it, because I can't get nearer than that. It's a visual metaphor. Oh yeah, if you've got a chance to see the webinar that Jean-Claude did with John, watch it. So this is this is chapter, I don't know what that is, but I think it's about the way we move, the way we do, because we can. And these were some yoga poses basically demonstrating that the tissue moves with us and we don't leave it in different ways. We don't leave it behind. And the idea that, we do a movement and we just take for granted that we can do the counter movement. So these are my illustrations, and just joking at the idea that when somebody gets stuck in eagle pose with their arms like that, they expect to be able to get out of that pose. We take that for granted, and this was just an image of people rushing somebody in eagle pose for structural release, as if that's what we need to live. So yeah, I was just having fun there. Dare I have fun with anatomy? The other reason for the pictures of Leonardo da Vinci was that I talk about the history of anatomy and how we developed the knowledge that we have now. And please remember that fascia was discovered in the Western world in dissection in 200 years ago by John Godman. And it was kind of buried because it wasn't convenient. It was too new a view 200 years ago. And the next person to really pick it up seriously was A.T. Still, the father of osteopathy. And 100 years ago, he was writing about what's just being discovered now in the research. So when I read people currently claiming to have discovered this and that about fascia, find their research papers is all I can say to you, because the amount of crap that's out there is really distressing, and you have to filter it because it's spoken with such authority. There's one particular person out there saying he was at the third Fascia Research Congress and da-da-da-da-da, as if that's an accreditation. It isn't. It just means he got to do a poster. So please be discerning. And the history, anybody claiming that they discovered it, I mean, give me a break. Jaap van der Waal, in fact, discovered that the tissue of the human elbow in a dissection in 1985, and the book references this and goes into great detail about his teachers, because he insisted on crediting them, that his work was buried. I mean, he showed that the tissue of the human elbow, basically what he did was, instead of dissecting the tissue away to show the muscle and the bone, like what you're seeing here now, he did the opposite. He dissected out the muscle and everything that wasn't tissue and showed that the human elbow was a continuity under tension, full of proprioceptive mechanoreceptors. That meant it was a sensory substrate. And it was just way too much information. It was way too outside the box, and it was buried in 1985. Robert Schleip found him, and in 2009, Jaap van der Waal was asked to present his original PhD from 1985. By that time, he was Emeritus Professor of Anatomy at Maastricht University, at the second International Fascia Research Congress. I'm talking keynote speaker now, so you can take for granted he knows what he's talking about. And if you ever get a chance to do any work with Jaap van der Waal, just do it. He's amazing. And he did this presentation of his work and showed that in 1985, I think he'd got it. And he was very upset on that occasion. I spent some time with him, and that his work had been buried for so many years. But since he's been given all this recognition ever since, I can't tell you, he's amazing. And his work now, he's retired, but he goes around the world teaching about embryology and taking the anatomy back to its origins. God, I wish he'd been my anatomy teacher. God, I wish he'd been my anatomy teacher. He's magical, and I do a lot of work with his work. He was fabulously helpful. He helped me write this chapter 5, told me I wasn't nearly daring enough. I was far too formal. But I was also lucky enough to be working with Professor Darrell Evans, who's an embryologist, and I had to bridge the gap then. I think my next incarnation will be a great deal more daring, because we know there's so much more knowledge out there now about the fascia. But thanks for that, John. That's brilliant. I'm agreeing and endorsing everything everyone's putting here about Jaap van der Waal and Jean-Claude Gamberteau. Please go and see all these people. But it does get confusing, and I really hope that, if nothing else, my book will give you a little bit of a way of stringing it all together, because I've met with them all, I've sat with them all, I've talked with them all, I've emailed them all. They were so generous. I think because I wasn't studying a PhD and I wasn't in competition, or they were just gorgeously helpful, but they loved helping me make a yoga book and make sense of it. So please know that the book honors their work. So anyway, this is the architecture thing, where the picture on the left, the big picture, is the standard anatomy that we're all trained in, and that we have an origin and insertion. And if you look at these pictures on the left, again, they're my illustrations, but they're not untypical of what you would see in a standard anatomy book. And what they imply is that the muscle is only attached to the bone at the origin and the insertion, that the muscle is this lovely clean thing that exists in space distinct from its neighbours, and that the angle at the elbow acts like a lever. And none of that's true. So when you look at a picture like the one at the top right, which is the triceps muscle, you notice that no matter what cross-section, yeah, I agree with you, Dr. Blechschmidt's notes, but if you read Jaap van der Waal's work, he will explain Blechschmidt's work, so you don't need to do that separately. Unless you're studying embryology, which is a different thing. So the picture on the top right is a slice of the triceps muscle. And what I invite you to notice there, and I go into much more detail in the book, is that there is not a single place on that slice that isn't connected. And it wouldn't matter if you took that slice every millimeter, it's all connected. So how do you get that image as a photograph to make sense of the picture on the left? The short answer is you don't. Because that picture on the left is an icon, it is a graphic artifact, and it makes absolutely sense of how we move. I mean, really, so little, it's quite embarrassing. So I obviously use the classical orange or grapefruit or lemon as an example, and I do it in a very simple diagram because my invitation is to my readers to use that for their students, so that you can understand these layers. And later on in the book, or in that chapter, I open out the orange and show you how you can show how the fascia represented by the orange peel, the pith, the covering of the segment, and the covering of the little tiny globules of juice inside the lip are all different expressions of the fascia, and not dissimilar to us thinking about that which wraps around the skin, what wraps around a muscle. The muscle fibers could be likened to the metaphor of the juice droplets, and it's quite a nice way of holding it. It's just that we keep going down in these ever finer depths of the tissue. So then chapter 4 is all about biotensegrity. There's Dr. Levin standing under Snelson's needle tower, which I've now got pictures of me standing under Snelson's needle tower. And basically this is the idea that we are basically a tension compression architecture. And now I can tell you why it's relevant that I work with chocolate. Basically, chocolate is soft matter. Our current paradigm for understanding biomechanics is based on hard matter physics. We are not hard matter, we are soft matter. So basically, according to Dr. Levin, and I totally endorse his work, is there are no levers, there are no upright inverted pendulums, and there are no discontinuities in biologic forms. So that's nice and controversial, depending on what level you're at and which academic institution you're in and how long you've known about fascia and whether you've followed through. Leonardo da Vinci got it. He understood amazingly because he spent so much time watching nature and observing and making sense of how things move. Snelson's needle tower is not necessarily an example of a human body because it's a tensegrity architecture. It's not a biotensegrity architecture. However, it represents a three-dimensional map of a close, packed system. What do I mean by that? If you imagine the bubbles on your cappuccino or the bubbles on the top of a beer, the froth, in a bag, another bubble, and more bubbles with bubbles inside them, and more bubbles with bubbles inside them, you have a sample of soft matter. You basically. Bags of bubbles, colloids, emulsions, bubbles of different types, sizes, thicknesses, fabrics, held together with these in this fantastic network of collagenous soup. And if you were to take the center of each of those bubbles and join them up with a line, you would have patterns. And if they were regularly packed, they would look like Snelson's Needle Tower. And if they were irregularly packed, they would look like Jean-Claude Gamberto's images under the skin. I'll just leave you to work with that. Basically, we are tension compression systems, and that can be adequately demonstrated. What's being taken a lot more time to make sense of is how we actually move the gross anatomy around the macro system as a biotensegrity architecture. How do we argue that? Because we've got to argue with a lot of history. Doesn't make it right. We think individual muscles are activated by individual nerves to move the body around, and we know that's a fallacy now. It's just not accurate. It's just not, and we'll get to that in chapter 9. But what this picture on the right is from Tom Flemons, who is another person, if you want to put on Tom Flemons, Flemons. And Tom Flemons made a lot of models for Dr. Levin, and I talk about him in my webinars, and there's much more detail on biotensegrity in those. And he sent me that drawing that he did and made a model of the human spine that actually makes sense of how the human spine moves. It takes more explanation, and I haven't got time, but trust me, it's worth following up. So this was the picture that we had. This is a lovely Victorian painting of the spine on the left, and it was a stacked column, which is hard matter physics. A column is hard matter physics. It holds up something above and below, and it's a compression system. And as you can see, my friend Katie, she of the picture at the beginning, who was inside the tube, is standing on one leg and doing various amazing things. That her yoga is utterly amazing, but there's no muscles in her foot strong enough or in her fingers strong enough to hold that. Doesn't make sense. And why isn't her spine falling off? If it's a stacked column, if you tilt a column in a building, you so much as tilt it, let alone turn it upside down or sideways, the building collapses. The structural integrity is at stake. So hard matter physics is the wrong model. It's a paradigm shift. We're not just changing content here. We're not just saying, oh, it's not muscles and bones, it's fascia. It is muscles and bones and fascia, and they combine in a particular three-dimensional geometry that makes sense of the fact that Katie can stand on one foot at this angle without her head falling off, which it would if it was a column. So my request is, after this webinar, delete the word column from your vocabulary about the spine, because it's not a column. That's a request. Anyhow, I'm getting more in my old age about the language. So the next chapter 5 was the one I did with Professor Darrell Evans and Emeritus Professor Jaap van der Waal, and I hope you enjoy it. This is one of my crazy drawings because I suddenly saw it all as bags within bags within bags within bags, or chambers within chambers within chambers. And the scale of the embryo compared to the mother it's inside of is just extraordinary. But when we think of ourselves as bags within bags within bags within bags within bags, and then the little tiny self-assembling bag in the middle, you are self-assembled. You need help, but you're self-assembled. And you expand and expand and expand and expand, and the mother expands and expands and expands and expands, and then there comes a tipping point where she contracts and contracts and contracts, and you shoot out, and then you start expanding and expanding and expanding and unfolding, and it's this incredible continuum of expansion and contraction. And there's an element of spiral motion and toroidal motion and all the stuff of the other dimensions that we are entering, which is why this is quite difficult to get your head around. This is my favourite chapter. It was the toughest chapter. It was the fastest learning curve, and I wish you luck with it because it's dense. But the complexity with which we grow ourselves is unbelievable. So, Anushka, thank you. I cannot tell you, go and work with Jaap van der Waal. It's just amazing. And he thinks Blechschmidt is amazing. I do too, but Blechschmidt is very hard to follow. I studied it inside out to write this chapter. It was a 1-year master's degree in embryology for me. And it got sent back to me 3 times by the publishers because it was too intellectual, too dense, too heavy. That doesn't mean I understand embryology. It means I know Jaap van der Waal is the most extraordinary teacher of it. And go work with him. He's amazing. These are my drawings. I'm just showing off now because I couldn't explain the wonder, the amazing, incredible way in which we grow ourselves. And being an artist at heart, I can't see it until I can draw it. And when I painted it, I realized something incredible. I have to share this with you because it sends me crazy. I know GPs who did embryology for 3 weeks in their medical degree or whatever it was, who think that the sphere of the amniotic sac and the sphere of the yolk sac where they touch each other, it's called the germ layer in between. And there's somehow this idea that this little bug, this little larva called you, starts off in this little germ layer in the in-between between the amniotic sac and the yolk sac. That's not accurate. And I want to see if you can really get this. I'm going to do my best to explain it. Imagine a blue water balloon. That is the amniotic sac. And imagine a yellow water balloon underneath it. That is the yolk sac. And where they meet, if you were able to see through those two water balloons, you would see where they joined a double-layered green oval disc. Yes, that is the embryo. It's called the bilaminar disc. It is the embryo. So the embryo is a continuity of the amniotic sac and the yolk sac. It's where they meet. And where they meet, there's two little membranes formed to join either end of the spherical, where the two spheres meet. The either end, something joins, and it's little tiny, tiny membrane forms. And one's called the cloacal membrane, and one's called the buccopharyngeal membrane. And the cloacal membrane is going to become the anus, and the buccopharyngeal membrane is going to become the mouth. And it starts off as where these two spheres join, and just beyond the buccopharyngeal membrane, these little tiny cells start to pump and pulse, and they're the cardiac cells. And the top part of the sac grows down over and buckles this way, so that the heart starts above the crown and folds down, and the crown and the brain and the face and the throat and the pharynx, all this, pharyngeal, larynx, all this, grow up from the heart. So the heart folds down and we fold round it and over it and grow up from it. So in the yogic world, I mean, it's just sheer heaven finding out that, you know, the 8th, 7th, 8th chakra, the heart starts, and then we fold down through the 7th, 6th, 5th and become the 4th, and the rest grows down 3, 2, 1 from it. So, I mean, it's heaven. And the other part of it that's heaven is that the geometry of the forming embryonic cells starts off as 1 conceptus, divides into 2, divides into 4, divides into 8, is the basis of the sacred geometry that Leonardo da Vinci drew that I showed you earlier. So this really is a very big deal to get your head around, and it is essential that you expand your mind to include it without going all hairy-fairy, as John Sharkey calls it. You can open up to the fact that there really is a geometry of soft matter, and it really is the same as what we call sacred geometry, and there really is maths and algebra for understanding it, and it really is the same maths and algebra of the cosmos. But we'll get to that. I don't want to sound like a lunatic. These are just images from the book showing the emergent properties surrounding and the surrounding tissues, and basically just I ask you to get the sacs are the own cells and tissue of the embryo, right? Form arises in fluids. Sort of, Gerald. Yes, of course, form arises in fluids. It arises in the mesenchymal fluids, which include the cells around the cells, or the membranes around the cells, and includes the stuff within that is the fascia and the potential fascia and the fascia that can bind in cells and unbind cells. So it's what we call the embryonic soup. But I have to keep going. So I just want you to notice the top 3 pictures there and the lower 3 pictures. The top 3 are my sketches of the lower 3 with their context. And I just invite you to keep thinking in context. It's not that muscles and bones are wrong. It's that muscles and bones reside in the collagenous matrix. And that's what's changing everything. And the fascia runs through them. And that's just a picture, my little picture of the embryo. So I'm going to move on. So if you can't see that slide, can you see this one? Oh, Chewy, you're very welcome. Can you see this one, Jan? I hope you can. Oh, sweetie, I can see it. Can anybody else not see? I don't know if anyone else. I'm going to keep going, Jan. You might have to re-upload because these are all on here. So this is the next chapter, chapter 5, and in it, I'm just looking at my copy of the book. Sorry, chapter 6, the breath, the bones, and the dermatomes. I talk about on the left there, the psoas, the iliopsoas. Don't get me going. If you look up in the classical anatomy of the iliopsoas, you will be told that if you look up the Gray's anatomy and you look up the psoas, you'll be directed to the iliopsoas. Excuse me. And I contend that that is an arbitrary affiliation. The psoas in my world is completely distinct, neighbour, cousin, best friend forever, call it what you will, with iliacus, quadratus lumborum, and the diaphragm. Hence the second drawing to the right. If you, and well, both of them, because in the body they are not separate. Come to the dissection and see. They're utterly beautiful. This, I had a wonderful yoga teacher, another wonderful yoga teacher called John. John, why's your name gone out of my head? I've got so many Johns in my head. Oh, John Wilkes, John Sharkey, John. Because his face in front of me. And he's just written a book for Handspring. So go on the Handspring website and look up his fabulous book. Oh my God, I can see his face in my brain. I'm sorry, I'm not well. Anyway, John, darling. Stirk, of course, Eve. John Stirk, bless him. John Stirk and Peter Blackaby were my teachers. Love them both to pieces. John Stirk's just written a book. It was absolutely fabulous. And I thought I was going to get to do some of the illustrations for it actually, but he found somebody much better than me. But he was fabulous teacher, and he made us study biomechanics and anatomy. He's the one. I drove him mad. I drove him absolutely mad asking questions. And John said, imagine the diaphragm as a muscle of walking and the psoas as a muscle of breathing. What do you get? And I don't know if John's ever found what I found in dissection, but we found those membranes and we found those, intimate relationships. And I just used the yoga pose to show that when we do a yoga pose with one leg, we treat the psoas differently on each side. We ask it to behave differently. Psoas as a spine stabilizer rather than a hip flexor. And that immediately opened magical doors to me. Magical doors. And I invite you to consider it the same. I write a lot about it in the book, so please do have a look. Then I talk about the dermatomes, the breath, the bones, and the dermatomes, and invite you to remember that the embryonic structures, such as the somites, forming the spaces between the vertebra and not the vertebra. If any book tells you that the somites form the vertebra, it's not accurate. The somites form half a vertebra, the space in between, and half the lower one, the next one. So those spaces designate what's called dermatomes on the skin, sclerotomes in the skeleton, and myotomes in the muscle, the different aspects from the outside to the inside. I've asked Robert if there's fasciatomes, and he laughed. And I think if we can just remember this map as well when we're holding the whole body in our mind, we start making sense of regional sensory domains or territories or contours of the body. And actually, I just bring it back to get more significance, because I think it's very important that we think of the body in these segmental regions, which of course yoga does because of the chakras, but not because they're specific segments, but because they're zones of awareness from the inside to the outside. And when we understand fascia as a sensory organ, that makes much more sense to us. This, by the way, is the tissue immediately under the skull. And in fact, this was dissected by Todd Garcia in the Anatomical Laboratory of Enlightenment. He used to be a partner of Gil Hedley. Todd is actually the clinical anatomist of the two, and his work is in a domain of its own. Like John Sharkey, it's a very precise whole body anatomical understanding, not just the fascia. And he does this beautiful, he did this for us, but this was an embalmed, it's traditional embalming. So the tissue sets and adheres, and it's much harder to dissect. Whereas in the teal dissection, some of this had disintegrated as soon as you took it out because it was soft, more like living tissue. And that was just to show you the inside of the head and inside the fascia holding the ethmoid and sphenoid, and it's just utterly beautiful. And my friend Shane McDermott took this photograph, and I rewired a hanger to show it so that we could actually see it. It was fabulous, and that was a dissection I did with Tom. So basically, I move on to say we can't necessarily understand the body in these planes. In traditional biomechanics, we are taught that there are 3 planes: transverse, coronal, and sagittal. The body doesn't have any flat planes. No straight lines, no flat planes, no levers, no upright inverted pendulums. There aren't any in biologic forms. Sorry. Even Ajo Zorn, who's done some fabulous research on how the upright inverted pendulum actually extends to the lumbar spine. Sorry. Whole body, whole and complete, from birth to death, whole one thing. No planes. Now, they're very useful references, absolutely, so that you know whether you're talking about the front and the back, or the side, or the top, or the base, or the inferior, anterior, and all that. But these are terms of reference. Bodies are not divided this way. We're curved. So this is the chapter where I talk about curved is the new straight. And we talk about primary and secondary curves, which is a picture that you see on the right. And you have to read the book to get this because it's fab, and it translates very beautifully into the geometry of form, which is pictured here. Again, I've scribbled over photographs of one of my colleagues, Alex, and that's an image from the picture, one of the pictures of Katie, just showing that there is a 3-dimensional geometry in existence that holds for one moment in time. And this is what we mean by emergent properties. And that's why it's very hard to get your head around fascia, because it changes, because we do. And we're talking about living bodies here. So new book of rules, guys. This is about biotensegrity in action, or elasticity, and I try to explain flexibility and stiffness and elasticity. And I'm not even going to attempt it in this webinar, but please watch the webinar that John Wilkes has, in which I describe that, because somebody who is super flexible and super bendy and lovely, soft, soggy biotensegrity or tensegrity toy, no, we don't want that. That's called Ehlers-Danlos. And it is not to be, it's basically hypermobility, and it's a nightmare. You don't want that. You want suitable stiffness to be able to walk around. And this is a cheetah. I don't know if you can see behind this cheetah, there's another one behind it in a beautiful curve in another direction. Our spines move in all kinds of directions. And that puppy is, I just want you to notice that he's, the puppy, sorry, I was just reading the things. Yes, John Stirk, if he's doing a webinar, grab it. He's fab. He's hilarious. He's hilarious. The puppy is right from the tip of its tail to the end of its nose is holding itself balanced so that it can really get that water but hold its whole body as a tensegrity architecture. And I just can't tell you that, excuse me, I am just seeing if the vets contacted me, which they haven't. I can't tell you how that shows the whole body held together. There's not one bit gets left out. And even the animal's tail is included in this balance counterbalance system of the whole body in space at all times. That's a paradigm shift. So this is the 9th chapter, one of my favorites, that quotes a lot of Robert Schleip and the HeartMath Institute and Mei-Wan Ho, Rainbow and the Worm, another fabulous scientist, and the research to show how the fascial matrix works as a sensory network, and that it is the largest sensory organ of the body. I recently read an article online in which somebody claims that we can't feel the fascia because it's not wired to the brain, but the muscles and tendons are wired to the brain, so we can feel those. I'm not allowed to swear online. Spherical nonsense, as my father would say. The fascia, the nearest I get to it, and I describe this in the book as a result of a conversation with Peter Haging, who is an extraordinary person in the world of fascia. And he explained this to me. It was brilliant, about how the body is kind of a hierarchy. And the nearest I can get to it is this. If you think of the primary colors, yellow, red, blue, as the central keystones of the central nervous system, and then we have secondary and tertiary colors. So when we blend red with yellow, we get orange. When we blend red with blue, we get purple. When we blend blue with whatever yellow, we get green. That's like the peripheral nervous system. And we get the secondary and the tertiary colors. But beyond that, we get these subtle expressions of color, the shades, the tones, the pastels, the hues. That's the fascia. And so we feel everything everywhere. It's just that we don't necessarily know what we're feeling, and we haven't got the language for this subtlety of sensation that we experience all the time. We call it proprioception, meaning the sense of one's own self. So it's your biofeedback system. And it doesn't make the nerves wrong. It doesn't mean nerves don't wire to muscles. It means that the tissue also informs, signals, and communicates. So that the main nerve, which is wrapped fascia anyway, cardiovascular tracts are all, neurovascular tracts are all wrapped in some form of fascial matrix and under tension. And the tension itself communicates, and the fabric itself communicates. So we are basically a listening device. We have, in some nerves, we have 4 times as many sensory aspects as we do motor. So this is a listening device, and it's already listening. It's the mind that didn't catch up. It's the mind that thinks this is all new. The body doesn't think it's new. It's always been like this. So what we're doing, what's so exciting, is that we're getting new distinctions, and we've got to be very careful that we use the language accurately with those distinctions. So I like to think I do, but when I wrote this book, I hadn't met John Sharkey, and I use the word layers, and he's explained, as Jan will endorse in the one series that we've been doing, there are no layers, they're depths. So we're getting even more specific about this language. I talk to my clients when they say, oh, it hurts. I say, what's the sensation? Is there a quality of, does it feel like it's burning? Does it feel like it's sticky? Does it feel like it's, and we grow their vocabulary of understanding, and it literally allows me to interpret what's going on and change. And that's this tensional network. And what you can see from this picture of, and this is spiders' webs out in the forest, is that if I put my hand under that little bush, that shrub, and shook the shrub, everything, every single part of that mesh would move, every part of it. And that would communicate. And it communicates a vibration, it communicates through mechanotransduction, it communicates through changing chemistry, it communicates through filters of fluids, it communicates through motion and kinetics, it communicates through the genetic coding. It's all there. It's so complex. It's a wonder we've survived this many years with the limited explanations we've had so far. I mean, I hope this just opens the door for you, because, well, if nothing else. The mechanoreceptors are considered, this is taken from Robert Schleip, adapted from Robert Schleip's work, Golgi, Pacini, Ruffini, and the interstitial free nerve endings. I don't have time to go into all of those, but I talk about them at some length in the book. And then I talk about the specifying terms of fascia, because there's so much controversy about them, and just invite the reader to understand what they're hearing depending on which level of academic literature they're reading. And I think I talk about this in one of the webinars, don't I, John? So I won't go into it now, but it's all there in the book, and I try to explain it in very straightforward terms, so it's extremely accessible. So then part 2 is about how we put this all into practice, and I'll move a bit quicker now because I appreciate that you've all been online for an hour. I can't believe my voice is still working. But we talk about animating the architecture. I go into anatomy trains, to which I'm obviously very loyal, but I think, as I said to you, they're the 2D of the 3D, so they're a great stepping stone. Don't learn them instead of your anatomy, because we want the 1D anatomy followed by the anatomy trains 2D into biotensegrity 3D. And you have to contain it in the sense and sentience, so it's all there. Yoga and something I call posture profiling, which I'll talk about in a minute. Adjustment of the fascial form, which again is for yoga teachers, because I consider all movement teachers to be manual therapists, and the way we touch people matters. And we are soft matter, so it matters how we integrate with soft matter. We become communication systems, and if you poke people, or in yoga classically force people, do you know what I'm saying? Anyhow, the elastic breath, so I bring the elastic body of the previous part into how we breathe, and that a lot of that is integrated with ancient yogic pranayama teachings, and I try to make sense of them. I don't reproduce the exercises. I try to explain why the yogis actually understood this elasticity, and we find out in part 3 that they actually understood all of this long before we did. And yoga for the fascial body is a simple practice, basically that, a very simple practice that you can do. Now, I want to make a point about that before I get to it. We tend to use fascial release as a blanket term, as if it means one thing, and you need to do a fascial release course or get a foam roller or fascia genius or fascia training in order to do what you should do to the fascia. Now, the reason that doesn't work as a concept is there's no such thing as the fascia. And what I mean by that is every aspect of the fascia expresses a different aspect of us. It's as complex as we are. Now, why that matters is that we sometimes behave as if the gross big movements, like going for a run or going to the gym and training, or horse riding or climbing a mountain, or somehow something that wears us out and exhausts us, is, or a big treatment, big muscle treatment, sports massage or whatever, all valuable, totally valuable, but it is the way to release the fascia. The deeper you go, the harder you. Remember, I'm trained in what is known as Rolfing, and we're taught to be very strong because it's very strong stuff and it adheres, and we've got to unadhere it, or it's resistant and we've got to make it resistant. The fascia, I hope I'm putting this across, has a range of expressions. It is on a scale. It is a polarity from very, very dense to not very dense at all, from very regular and close to very irregular. And these polarities exist. So for every hard thing that we do and need to do, a soft thing at the other end of that scale is also needed by the tissue, or the tissue can't respond in its fullest variety. It just can't. So what I do in this last part of this section is a simple practice where the body begins to be able to do a practice that is soft and restorative. It's called restorative yoga. It's what I'm trained in. And it's a very simple practice. Anybody can do it. And I really recommend it as the other part of the wheel. Get fit, sure, but take care of your tissue and do something that's in between strong and nothing. So this is another image of Casey. I just love it. It's just so beautiful. And this is Samira on the left. This is my curved is the new straight. Because as you can see, there's no straight lines anywhere. So why would we want to put it into straight sagittal, coronal and transverse planes? Not the body, it's just a reference, but we forget that. And we talk with proper anatomical drawings and about sitting up curved. We can't sit up straight because we're not. So I talk about in practice how the spine loves to be in its appropriate curves, especially in sitting. And it's all illustrated and described, and it's not cogently argued because it's not about this is my way. It's about making sense of how the body is, the architecture of the body actually works and appears and behaves. And from a biotensegrity point of view, this all makes beautiful sense. The next chapter is yoga and anatomy trains, and I redrew them as sweeps. or what I call bands, because when you're using this for movement analysis or posture profiling, you have to learn to see shadows and bands. You can't see gluteus maximus. You can see the region in which it resides under the skin through the adipose tissue and the fascia, but you don't get to see gluteus maximus or any other muscle other than by its shadow continuity or its band that it's part of, unless you are in surgery or dissection, hopefully. I was thinking back to when I cut my knee open, I saw far more muscle than I wanted to, but you get my drift. So these are the front line and the back line, and I don't know if there's any more here. And I show them in, for example, the front and the back line. I do this with all the lines. I show them how you can't body read with them unless you use them in pairs, because in motion, A, you have to see them at a completely different rate, and B, they work together. So we look at something like the back and the front in a forward bend or a back bend, and we look at the sides relative to each other, and or the deep front line, and so on. So it's very practical, this part of the book. So it's how you actually apply these principles to reading the body, and you continue to work with it in a living sense. That's the emphasis on this part of the book. This is the arm lines, and this is trying to show the deep front line as part of the breathing mechanism and how posture and breathing are completely interrelated. This is posture profiling, very quickly and unfairly, because it's a fabulous chapter and it's a really useful way of reading the body. But we basically see fascia typing. We have to be very careful. These are very soft graphs. But I can't wait to have a course together in this, because it would just be so valuable to everybody. So I'm going to do it in the future. We talk about Viking to jungle, where Viking is very strong. It's the asterisk, Obelix type character, big muscles, and Nordic, and the cold and brute force. And at the other end of that scale, that polarity, is the jungle body, where we thin and wiry moves through very quickly and sinewy, and you could think of them in the jungle not making a sound as they move through. Think Avatar. And then the vertical scale of ectomorphic, mesomorphic, endomorphic, and we one being very staccato and fast, and the middle one being in the middle, and the endomorphic being much slower and softer, and sometimes just as sensitive, but more still, more gut-based. I explain where these terms come from. I liken them to equivalent yoga terms, and I give a sense of how you can body read people and place them on this graph. And your task is always, how can I move this person nearer to the center? It's all explained in the book, and it's great, and I'm going to do workshops on it because it's fabulous. People really get it when they do it. We look at the geometry of the postures, and this is all about adjustment. This is another of my favorite chapters, because you read books on adjustment in yoga, they talk all about adjusting the poses, and you get a list of poses and how to adjust them. How do you do that? We don't adjust poses, we adjust people. So without making them wrong, or saying that that's not how it does, as my son would say when he was little, that's not how it does. Everyone's yoga poses are unique to them, and you adjust it according to their balance and the footprint that you make with them, because you become a closed kinematic chain. Another whole thing. I haven't got time, but I just want to show you it. So then I talk about the elastic breath cycle. So I take everything that we learned intellectually in part one and apply it in practice to breathing. I think this is a brilliant chapter. My friend Linda Dantal helped me do this. She's got a place called Treehouse Yoga in London. And if anybody wants to do vinyasa flow in a way that is like restorative yoga, but all joined up, and get the breathing in their bodies rather than in their minds, go and see Linda Dantal at Treehouse Yoga. She's absolutely amazing. And this is an image of how the breathing cycle works in that way. So you can see it all in the book, and it's in yogic terms as well, but they're separate, distinct. You don't need to be a yogi to get it. It's how the fascia spring loads our breath, and we work with this elastic cycle of tension, compression, and compliance. So I explain how the elastic principles of the previous part of the book makes sense in motion, and breathing acuity. And this is the images of a simple practice. So every single pose is illustrated and demonstrated how you do the movements. It's all, these are the drawings that make it make sense. So finally, we're nearly there. I promised John I wouldn't go on for more than an hour and a half. Part 3 is much more about how we internalize the fascia and how the history behind this geometry comes full circle, because in fact we learn in the archetypal geometries that the ancient yogis understood geometry. Geometry comes from Gaia metria, geometria, geometer, geometry. And Gaia is the earth goddess, Mother Earth, and metria comes originally from meter, measure, and actually that is a derivative of mater. So it literally means, geometry literally means the measure of Mother Earth. And very interestingly, people like Nassim Harim and the Resonance Project, and lots of people now are really getting very excited about understanding the dimensions that we occupy and the correlates between the what's called the icosahedral resonance in the cosmos and in the body, once we understand it as soft matter and a whole united geometric function of soft matter. It's the same physics because it's living matter. And the difference is that the classical biomechanical notions are rooted sometimes in hard matter physics, and you can't mix them because we're not hard matter, basically. It's not rocket science. But anyway, apparently it is rocket science for different reasons. Anyway, this is Samira. Isn't that beautiful? That's just the most beautiful, beautiful image. Samira and Katie, by the way, both in London. If you can find their yoga classes, email me and I'll put you through to their schools if any of you are in London. Katie's in Dedham in Essex now. And anyone near them, go and see them, go and work with them. They are fabulous, fabulous yoga teachers and beautiful to boot. I mean, my God, dream on. Wow. So this is an even simpler practice than the previous one. This practice is called Fascia Muktasana, which means freeing the fascia, and it comes from Pawan Muktasana, which means freeing the winds or the wind currents. And the wind currents, we think of wind currents, tidal currents, electrical currents. Currents in yoga are very important, and they are waves. They are the resonance in the body, and the yogis understood it. It's quite extraordinary because you can read so much in the ancient yogic texts that we're just discovering about fascia now with all these advanced modern technologies. It's hilarious. But anyway, well, that's another whole thing. And this very, very subtle practice where you simply open and close the hands, move the wrists, the elbows, the shoulders, you open and close the feet, move the ankles, the knees and the hips, and then you work on the neck. And it's a 20-minute, it's very beautiful. And you find yourself sitting much more beautifully as if the dermatomes or the subtle pathways of energy or the chakras or the whole tissue fluid field of the internal soft tissue matrix or the fascia itself is somehow freed and breathing. And I've had the great privilege to work teaching people this over years of all ages, from 8 to 88, 98 actually was my oldest client. And it makes the most amazing difference with the most subtle and non-invasive work. So it's there in the book in great detail. Literally every minute of it is detailed in what you do and how you do it, and illustrated. And then there is a breathing meditation. So the name of the practice, if you go to the Bihar School of Yoga, Bihar, Bihar School of Yoga, you will find Pawan Muktasana. And that means freeing the winds. Pawan, Muktasana, Muktasana, Pawan Muktasana, freeing the winds. And it's adapted from that, and I call it Fascia Muktasana, freeing the fascia. And do I ever come up to London to teach yoga? Yeah, I will. Invite me. I do sometimes. And basically, Fascia Muktasana is very, very subtle. And then what the idea is to bring that to an even more subtle level. And this is called the I am meditation. My friend Alex, who you saw, I drew over him in a previous image. Alex gave me this meditation specifically for the book, which is very beautiful. It's called the I am meditation. And I illustrate it and guide people through. And basically what I'm looking to do in this third part of the book is have this fascial internal balancing and freeing experienced. So we go out of the realm of thinking and into the realm of application on the body, and then even deeper into the realm of awareness. And that's what I try to do with the 3 layers of the book. And it's a seriously ambitious project. Took twice as long as it was supposed to, as Handspring will tell you. And I hope we get there. So this is what I talk about: the being, the body, and the mind, or the intellect. We have thought, we have instinctive movement, and we have conscious awareness in those 3 layers. And I talk about that as an integrated practice. You're welcome, Meta. And then I talk about sacred geometry. And sacred geometry is another thing I'd love to come up to London and teach one day, to get people with their pairs of compasses and stuff, because something amazing happens when you draw the geometries that your body resonates with. And you do these practices to get your body resonating with this multi-dimensional awareness. And what happens, because this is actually considered to be the geometry of consciousness. Now, I've just stopped being scientific, but there is science behind this. And when you draw these geometric patterns, and you draw the basic sacred geometry flower of life, which I'm wearing here around my neck, which is based on the geometry of our formation as embryos, something very magical starts to happen. You actually start to resonate with what you're doing. And people come up with, I went into a trance, I'm all flowy, I can feel, and you get these wonderful, cynical intellectuals with their pairs of compasses doing these drawings, like, it's not going to make any difference to me. And it does. And it's just like, wow. And that thrills me. So one of the things I talk about is creating mandalas, which is basically a geometry, so that we can create class plans. And I actually do this as plans for clients for their anything they want to do at home, yoga clients usually. And I just show you how to create a mandala flow and how to use polarity in the designing of a yoga lesson. Another thing I'd love to teach separately. Anyway, so this is a lovely wheel, this of polarities, where basically the top half of the wheel is the pose, the bottom half of the wheel is the counter pose in the opposite position, and it resonates with this idea of polarity rather than duality. My pendant, I don't know if you can see it. It's called the Flower of Life. There we go. And what it is every single circle overlaps another circle and forms what's called a Vesica Pisces, and it's a basis of the geometry that Leonardo drew at the beginning of this presentation, and it makes sense of soft matter physics. That's the best I can do at this moment, but go to another webinar, you'll see it all drawn up. And this is using these polarities in training people in yoga poses, so that it's just great fun. And again, another thing I will be doing in the future. And these are different ones. This is a much more rigorous one on the left for a fit young man, and showing how you do dog pose and counter pose. And basically what I'm saying is, regardless of the tradition in yoga where we do all downward dog, humble, folded, flexion-based movements for however long it is till our guru tells us that we can stop being so humble and start doing back bends, I say, no, doesn't work. Body fascia needs polarizing movements. And that's what these are all about. So it's just to bring balance to the tissue throughout, and it's particularly important with people that work at home on their own. I'm sure you do this in your practice, whatever your practice is. It's if someone's been lying down, then when you get them up, you bring them back into being upright, so that there is a shift in their awareness and they have time to follow through. Fascia's job in the body, in my opinion, is to bring us into balance or homeostasis. And if that's the case, why would we just train it in one direction? So it just doesn't make sense to me, hence the book. And then this is where I get really thrilled. I go into the history of sacred geometry. And we go into the history of numbers, which we call the Arabic numerals that we use. And the Arabic numerals actually were not from Arabia. The Arabians called them the Hindu Sat, and they came from the Indus Valley. I've had people challenge me that they actually originated in China. I think they originated in the Indus Valley because there's some very, very ancient drawings of these numbers. And we had Roman numbers, and this will be relevant in a minute. We had Roman numbers, and when the Roman numerals were designed, they were mostly straight lines, not all. There is a C and a D, but mostly they were all straight lines, and there was no zero. So we had no concept of zero. And the concept of zero is considered to be the biggest breakthrough in mathematics in the Western world. And one of the people who insisted on learning about the new numerals and how to use them and understand the concept of zero was Leonardo da Vinci. And his book, Divina Proporzioni, there's only 2 copies in the world, Divine Proportion, is what makes sense of the Fibonacci code and pi and how it expresses divine proportion in the body. And it will blow you away. And he insisted on learning these forms, and the concept of zero changes everything. Because it forms a triumvirate. It forms 3 things. You have to have 0, nothing, or neutral in order to have positive and negative. So it takes us out of the world of duality, plus or minus, positive or negative, black or white, right or wrong, and into the world of polarity, united in 3 things. The concept of zero gives us 3 things: plus, minus, neutral. Electron, proton, neutron. We have to have 3 things, and the basis of biotensegrity is triangulation, the Holy Trinity. So the details of all this were all behind long before Christianity came along. And we have these profound depths of knowledge in this sacred geometry. And there are yogic poems, sutras. And if you read them, Sanskrit had what's called an alphanumeric correspondence, like Greek and Hebrew. And if you translate the words of these poems and get their alphanumeric correspondences, there's 1 to the divine that adds up to pi to 32 decimal places over 10. There ain't no way that's a coincidence. Sorry. So in those times, the sounds we made, the Sanskrit words we used for the yogic postures, the resonance fields we create with chanting, resonated through the system. And they really, really do if you understand the fascia as a tensional network. And it's exactly the same principle that if you have 2 guitars in the room and they're both tuned, and you pluck the E string on one guitar, the E string only will resonate on the other guitar from the other end of the room. And that's a known fact. So I invite you to consider that when you think of yourself as a highly tuned instrument and your fascial network as suitably strung, guitar has to have sufficient stiffness. It starts to make sense of the collagen network and as a force transmission network, as a resonance field. So if we think in fields, we'll get there, but we have to understand these numerics, and this is basically archetypal geometry. It gives rise to these patterns. There's the flower of life. That's what I'm wearing around my neck. The egg of life is the pattern of the 3rd division of the embryo. The flower of life is the pattern of the 8th division of the embryo before it implants. So you can actually trace the embryology. You can trace all these patterns through the embryology. It's absolutely unbelievable. It gets deeper and deeper and deeper. You can go all sorts of places. And you end up with these spirals and spiraling threads, which in yoga are called nadis. And they are the nerve currents. And they can be readily explained by understanding the fascia as a neural sensory tissue, which I just found so exciting. I mean, it emerged from the work. It was, oh, bah. So here you have the picture of the dermatomes that I showed you at the beginning of the book, and I then put the chakras over the dermatomes, and it gets quite exciting. And I kind of leave it there because that's the end of the book. And that's where, having done all that now, I've kind of started again and going into different dimensions now. We're just doing some work with the 4th dimension, and it's getting very exciting. I am going to be breaking the book down into its component parts and making workbooks from different things. And so do keep in touch. Do go on my website, become a subscriber. I don't write very often, but when I do, it will be to inform you of something fun and interesting.